Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past speaks to the present. Today, we journey back to the year 1692, into the heart of Puritan New England, where fear and faith collided in one of the darkest chapters of American history, the Salem Witch Trials. In a small village gripped by paranoia, neighbors turned against neighbors. Invisible evidence condemned the innocent, and the voices of frightened children shook the very foundations of law and justice. This is not just a story of witches. It is a story of fear, hysteria, power, and the human tendency to destroy what it does not understand. From the first strange fits of the afflicted girls to the terrifying gallows of Salem, from the collapse of the court's authority to the centuries of reflection that followed, this history reveals how fragile justice can be when blinded by paranoia. Through we will unravel not only what happened in Salem, but why it still matters today. This is a tale of tragedy, but also of lessons about liberty, evidence, truth, and the dangers of mass hysteria that echo through every age. Stay with me, because once you enter Salem, you will see history not as something distant, but as something alive, a warning that still whispers to us today. At the heart of the tragedy lay Salem Village, a small farming community on the edge of Salem town, which was bustling with trade and prosperity. Salem Village was marked by tension, both social and economic. Many residents were subsistence farmers who resented the growing wealth of Salem town merchants, whose ties to the outside world seemed to weaken traditional values. These economic divisions mirrored deeper fractures within the community. Families quarreled over land boundaries, inheritance rights, and control of local institutions. In the middle of this fragile balance stood Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village's church. Parris, a former merchant turned preacher, embodied the community's anxieties. He demanded strict obedience, preached fiery sermons about Satan's plots, and warned that the devil was constantly attacking their fragile outpost of godliness. His leadership polarized the congregation. Some saw him as a necessary spiritual guardian, while others resented his authoritarian style and the taxes imposed to support his ministry. Compounding these internal struggles was the influx of refugees fleeing from wars on the northern frontier. King William's War had ravaged settlements, leaving survivors traumatized and desperate. Refugee families brought with them horrific stories of massacres and destruction at the hands of both native tribes and French forces. These stories reinforced the villagers' sense that they were besieged by evil forces on all sides, with neighbors turning against neighbors, and every misfortune interpreted through the lens of sin and Satan. Salem Village was already a tinderbox awaiting a spark. That spark came in the winter of 1692, ignited in the most unexpected place, the household of Reverend Parris himself. In January of 1692, strange events began within the parsonage of Reverend Parris. His daughter, 9-year-old Betty Parris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to display bizarre and terrifying symptoms. They screamed in pain, fell into convulsions, contorted their bodies into unnatural positions, and claimed unseen forces were pinching and pricking them. They barked like dogs and hurled household objects. When a doctor was finally summoned to explain their afflictions, he could find no physical cause. His diagnosis carried weight in a society steeped in supernatural fear. The children, he declared, were under the influence of witchcraft. This conclusion set Salem ablaze. In a community already haunted by fear of Satan, the idea that the devil was working through human agents within their own village confirmed the worst nightmares of the Puritan imagination. Other young girls soon began exhibiting similar fits, including in Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott. Their convulsions, screams, and claims of torment only amplified the panic. To the villagers, the evidence was undeniable. Invisible spirits, sent by witches, were attacking innocent children. Attention turned to those in the community who were vulnerable, disliked, or simply different. In February, Pressured by adults and their own escalating visions, the afflicted girls named 3 women as tormentors: Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved servant; Sarah Good, a poor beggar woman; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly widow entangled in scandal and lawsuits. With those accusations, the machinery of fear began to move. What had started as mysterious illness in 2 children would grow into one of the darkest episodes in early American history. The Salem Witch Trials had begun, fueled by terror, belief, and a desperate need to explain the unexplainable. The first names spoken by the afflicted girls of Salem set the pattern for everything that followed. In February 1692, under growing pressure to identify the sources of their torment, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams accused 3 women who could not easily defend themselves. The first was Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved servant of either African or Caribbean origin. To the Puritan villagers, Tituba represented an outsider, foreign, non-English, non-Puritan, and therefore suspicious. Her cultural background, with knowledge of folk practices and stories, made her a ready target in a society where anything unusual was equated with witchcraft. The second accused was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who survived by relying on the charity of her neighbors. She was often seen muttering angrily when turned away at doors, and in a world where words were believed to hold real spiritual power, those mutterings were seen as curses. The third was Sarah Osborne, an older woman entangled in property disputes and accused of neglecting church attendance. In Puritan eyes, a woman who failed in her religious duties and challenged traditional land inheritance laws was already stepping outside the community's moral boundaries. Each of these women carried social stigma that marked them as vulnerable to suspicion. The accusations against them revealed something deeper. The trials were not only about religion or superstition, but also about power, class, and who belonged in the community. By targeting the marginalized, Salem's villagers could reinforce their fragile sense of unity against a common enemy. Fear found its scapegoats, and the process of naming witches had begun. When the accused women were examined by local magistrates in March 1692, the proceedings shocked the community. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied the charges against them, but the afflicted girls continued to collapse in fits at the sight of the accused, screaming that invisible specters were attacking them. In Puritan courts, spectral evidence, visions and dreams in which the devil or his agents appeared, was treated with deadly seriousness. But it was Tituba's testimony that turned Salem's panic into a frenzy. At first, she denied practicing witchcraft, but relentless questioning, combined with the physical and psychological pressure of her position as an enslaved woman, broke her resistance. She confessed, but her confession was no simple admission of guilt. Instead, she spun a vivid narrative of dark conspiracies and unholy forces. She spoke of seeing black dogs, red cats, and strange birds, of witches riding on sticks, of covens plotting against Salem. She claimed she had been approached by the devil himself, who urged her to sign a book alongside other witches. Whether these details came from Tituba's imagination, from coercion, or from the expectations of her interrogators, the result was the same. Her story electrified the magistrates and the public. The people of Salem, already primed to believe that Satan was attacking them, suddenly had confirmation from within their own community. A hidden army of witches was at work. Tituba's confession gave legitimacy to the accusations and ensured that the hunt for witches would not stop at just 3 women. The fear became self-sustaining, a fire fed by every word spoken in that courtroom. The consequences of the first trials rippled outward at terrifying speed. Ordinary villagers, once hesitant, now whispered the names of neighbors they had long distrusted. Old grudges and rivalries resurfaced, reframed as evidence of witchcraft. A cow dying suddenly, a child falling ill, a crop withering in the field. Any misfortune could be blamed on an unseen spell. In a world where people truly believed Satan was orchestrating attacks on their community, accusations required little proof beyond suspicion. Fear spread not just within Salem village, but to surrounding towns, as people carried rumors of witches across the countryside. Ministers delivered sermons warning of the devil's schemes, and each new accusation reinforced the belief that the community was under siege. The afflicted girls continued to convulse and scream, pointing fingers at new victims. Their dramatic performances, whether born of genuine psychological distress, social pressure, or deliberate manipulation, convinced the public that the devil was indeed at work. By April, dozens of names have been mentioned, and jails began to fill with accused men and women. The machinery of panic, once set in motion, could not easily be stopped. Salem was no longer dealing with a handful of strange illnesses, but with a full-scale moral crisis. The first accusations had cracked open a door, and through that opening poured a flood of fear, suspicion, and paranoia that would engulf the entire colony. By the spring of 1692, Salem Village was no longer dealing with an isolated incident of strange fits among children or the trial of 3 marginalized women. The crisis had grown into a wildfire spreading across Essex County and beyond. The accusations that began in Reverend Parris's household seeped into every corner of daily life. More villagers began reporting unusual experiences, spectral visions at night, livestock behaving strangely, sudden illnesses that had no apparent cause. Each personal misfortune was quickly interpreted as proof of witchcraft. And with Tituba's confession of a wider conspiracy still fresh in people's minds, suspicion became contagious. Neighbors looked at one another with narrowed eyes, wondering who among them had signed the devil's book. Quarrels that had smoldered for years suddenly transformed into accusations. Families who disputed land boundaries now accused each other of using dark powers to steal prosperity. Women who had quarreled over inheritance rights were branded as witches seeking revenge. In this way, the trials became a stage on which old grievances were reenacted under the guise of religious duty. Salem's small disputes now carried the weight of eternal salvation and damnation. At first, it was women who bore the brunt of suspicion, especially those who were poor, elderly, or otherwise outsiders. But soon men were accused as well. Farmers, tavern keepers, even respected church members. The logic of suspicion knew no boundaries once it had taken root. The expanding circle of the accused signaled that the witch crisis was no longer a problem confined to Salem Village, but was becoming a colony-wide panic that threatened to consume all of Massachusetts. At the heart of the spreading hysteria were the testimonies of the afflicted girls. Their dramatic fits and accusations provided the fuel that kept the trials alive. Whenever a suspected witch was brought into the room, the girls would shriek, fall into convulsions, claim to see spectral animals, or cry out that the accused was stabbing them with invisible needles. Their performances convinced magistrates and onlookers alike that the devil's presence was undeniable. To the Puritan mind, there was no explanation other than witchcraft. How else could children scream in unison, writhe on the floor, and describe visions of shadowy figures tormenting them? The authority of these girls grew as more people accepted their claims. And Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and others became central players in Salem's unfolding drama. Some historians believe they were motivated by social pressures, trauma from frontier wars, or subconscious desire for attention and authority. Others suggest that their accusations reflected the rivalries and grievances of their families, who sometimes benefited when enemies were accused. Whatever the reasons, the power of their words was extraordinary. A simple gesture from one of these girls could doom an accused person to imprisonment or even death. Their testimonies multiplied the number of accused witches at an astonishing rate. By late spring, over 100 people had been swept into the web of suspicion. The girls had become the unlikely arbiters of life and death in Salem, and their influence ensured that the panic would not subside but escalate further. As accusations multiplied, the legal system of Massachusetts struggled to keep pace. Small village jails, built to hold petty criminals or debtors, were suddenly overcrowded with accused witches. Men and women of all ages, from teenagers to the elderly, found themselves shackled and awaiting trial. Families were torn apart as fathers, mothers, and children were imprisoned on suspicion of serving the devil. For the accused, the conditions were grim: cold, damp cells, scarce food, and constant humiliation. Many families were forced to pay for their relatives' upkeep in prison, bankrupting them in the process. Even respected members of society could not escape suspicion. Martha Corey, a full member of the Salem Church, was accused and arrested despite her long-standing reputation for piety. Her case shocked the community, for if even the devout could be witches, then no one was safe. Soon after, Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her kindness and Christian faith, was accused as well. The arrest of such respected figures demonstrated that the trials were spinning beyond anyone's control. Fear had reached the highest levels of society, and the net of suspicion now encompassed the most unlikely individuals. By May, the jails of Essex County and Boston held more than 150 accused witches. Families were left destitute, children orphaned, and entire households ruined. What had started with a handful of accusations had grown into a tidal wave of paranoia that threatened to drown the colony in chaos. Salem had crossed the point of no return. The trials had become a full-scale crisis, and the worst was yet to come. By May of 1692, the number of accused witches had grown so large that the ordinary legal system of Massachusetts could no longer manage the crisis. The colony was in political turmoil. Its original charter had been revoked years earlier, and a new royal charter had only recently arrived with Governor Sir William Phips. The sudden flood of witchcraft cases demanded urgent attention, and so a special tribunal was created, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine. This extraordinary court was established in Salem specifically to deal with the witchcraft outbreak. Presided over by Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton and several other prominent magistrates. The court was empowered to handle the growing backlog of cases with speed and authority. Yet from its inception, the court was shaped more by fear and theology than by rational justice. Evidence that would never stand in a modern courtroom, spectral testimony, hearsay, dreams, and visions, was accepted as legitimate proof. The magistrates entered the proceedings convinced that witches were real and that Satan was actively working through them. Their purpose was not to carefully weigh evidence, but to purge the colony of evil. The creation of this court marked a turning point. What had previously been scattered examinations by local magistrates was now a centralized and official process. Salem was no longer dealing with isolated accusations. The colony had established a formal mechanism for what amounted to state-sponsored witch hunts. With the Court of Oyer and Terminer in place, the trials would accelerate dramatically, leading to executions and a reign of terror unlike anything Massachusetts had seen before. The first person tried and condemned by the Court of Oyer and Terminer was Bridget Bishop, a woman already notorious in Salem for her unconventional behavior. Bishop was in her 60s, twice married, and ran a tavern that hosted card games and late-night gatherings, activities frowned upon by the strict Puritans. She dressed more flamboyantly than most women, sometimes wearing bright red clothing, which Puritans considered vain and sinful. All of these characteristics made her a convenient target. When she was accused of witchcraft, witnesses testified that she had bewitched their animals, caused illnesses, and appeared in spectral form to torment them. The afflicted girls collapsed dramatically during her trial, screaming that her spirit was attacking them in the courtroom itself. Bridget denied all charges, insisting on her innocence, but the weight of spectral evidence and her reputation for disobedience doomed her. The court found her guilty, and on June 10th, 1692, she was hanged on Gallows Hill, the first official execution of the Salem Witch Trials. Her death shocked the colony. For some, it confirmed that the court was fulfilling its duty to rid Massachusetts of witches. For others, her execution raised troubling doubts. If spectral evidence could condemn someone to death, then who could be safe? The trial of Bridget Bishop set the pattern for what was to follow. It demonstrated that the court was willing to accept flimsy evidence, that public hysteria could overwhelm rational judgment, and that once accused, escape was nearly impossible. The machinery of death had been set in motion, and it would not stop easily. The establishment of the court of Oyer and Terminer did not bring calm or resolution to the colony. Instead, it institutionalized fear. With each trial, the legitimacy of spectral evidence grew stronger, and the accusations spread wider. Magistrates and ministers preached that Satan's power was growing and that every good Christian had a duty to help expose witches. Ordinary people began to see accusations as a way to protect themselves from suspicion. By naming others, they diverted attention away from their own families. The court encouraged confessions, and those who admitted to witchcraft and named accomplices were often spared execution. This created a perverse incentive: confess and live, or deny and die. As a result, the number of accused multiplied at a staggering pace. Salem's jails overflowed, new prisoners were shackled daily, and fear permeated every home. The authority of the court, far from restoring order, made the hysteria official. Now, executions were not the acts of mobs, but the decisions of magistrates acting in the name of law and God. The line between justice and persecution had collapsed completely. With Bridget Bishop's hanging, the colony had crossed a threshold. The community was no longer simply punishing suspicious individuals. It was systematically destroying lives based on fear and imagination. In the months to come, the gallows would claim many more victims, and the court of Oyer and Terminer would stand as the symbol of a society consumed by paranoia. Salem had become a stage where fear dictated law, and truth was silenced by terror. After the hanging of Bridget Bishop in June 1692, the machinery of the Salem Witch Trials moved with terrifying speed. Over the course of that summer, one execution after another took place, each one intensifying the atmosphere of dread that hung over the colony. The next to face the gallows were Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and the elderly Rebecca Nurse. These women, tried in July, all proclaimed their innocence, but the court dismissed their pleas. The afflicted girls continued their dramatic performances, collapsing and shrieking whenever the accused looked in their direction. The magistrates interpreted this as proof of guilt rather than theater. On July 19th, 5 women were executed together on Gallows Hill. Among them, the case of Rebecca Nurse struck the hardest blow to the conscience of Salem. At 71 years old, Rebecca was widely respected as a kind and deeply religious woman. Initially, a jury had even acquitted her, but under pressure from the judges, the verdict was reconsidered, and she was condemned. Her execution horrified some, for if someone as pious as Rebecca Nurse could be hanged as a witch, then anyone could fall victim. Yet fear silenced most dissent. By August, more trials followed, and the gallows claimed additional victims. George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village; Martha Carrier, accused of being a powerful witch; John Willard, once a constable who had arrested witches but later questioned the trials; and several others. With each execution, the panic spread further. The message was clear: innocence offered no protection, and anyone who stood against the hysteria risked the noose. Salem had become a place where death was the reward for courage, and survival required submission to lies. Among the executed in August was George Burroughs, a former minister whose trial revealed just how twisted the logic of the witch hunt had become. Burroughs had once served as the pastor of Salem Village, but left under strange circumstances, quarreling with parishioners over salary disputes. Years later, his old conflicts resurfaced in deadly form. The afflicted girls accused him of being the leader of the witches' conspiracy, claiming he commanded spectral armies and presided over dark rituals. Witnesses testified that he had extraordinary strength, lifting heavy barrels with ease, which they claimed was evidence of supernatural assistance. Despite Burroughs's calm defense and his insistence on his innocence, the court condemned him. His execution on August 19th became one of the most shocking moments of the trials. As he stood on the gallows, Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something widely believed to be impossible for a witch to do. The crowd murmured in astonishment, and for a brief moment, doubt rippled through the onlookers. Could an agent of Satan truly call on God so faithfully? Yet the magistrates pressed forward, insisting that Satan could mimic holy words to deceive the faithful. Burroughs was hanged, silencing the doubts of the fearful crowd. His death illustrated how far Salem had strayed from reason. Even the most obvious signs of innocence were reinterpreted as evidence of guilt. The execution of a minister, supposedly a man of God, revealed that no one was beyond suspicion. The trials were devouring the very institutions they claimed to protect, twisting piety itself into proof of witchcraft. By late summer, the Salem Witch Trials had become not just a village affair, but a colony-wide catastrophe. The number of accused had swelled into the hundreds, filling jails from Salem to Boston. Families lived in constant fear, knowing that a careless word, an enemy's grudge, or the whims of the afflicted girls could lead to arrest. Confession became the only path to survival, and many desperate individuals falsely admitted to witchcraft, naming others in order to save themselves. This cycle of accusation and confession created a chain reaction that spread suspicion through every layer of society. The wealthy and poor alike were vulnerable. Prominent landowners, respected church members, and even children were swept into the hysteria. The courts demanded obedience to their rulings, and those who questioned the legitimacy of the trials risked being accused themselves. Ministers preached sermons warning of the devil's growing power, reinforcing the fear that paralyzed the community. The gallows became a grim spectacle, drawing crowds who both feared and hungered to witness the purging of witches. Yet beneath the surface, unease was growing. Some whispered that too many respected people had been condemned, that the court's reliance on spectral evidence was dangerous, that perhaps the devil's greatest trick was convincing Salem to destroy itself. Still, few dared to speak openly. To challenge the trials was to risk being branded a witch. The summer of 1692 left a trail of corpses and a community drowning in paranoia. Salem had entered its darkest season, and the storm showed no sign of ending. By the early autumn of 1692, Salem had reached a fever pitch of fear. 19 people had already been executed, and scores more languished in overcrowded prisons. Yet, amidst the thunder of accusations and the grim toll of the gallows, quiet doubts began to surface. Some members of the community, though terrified to speak aloud, started to wonder whether the trials had gone too far. The case of Rebecca Nurse, the gentle grandmother who had been executed despite her reputation for holiness, haunted many consciences. The execution of George Burroughs, a minister who had recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly before his death, gnawed at the faith of onlookers. Could the devil truly mimic the sacred words of God? If so, how could anyone ever be trusted again? More troubling still, the accusations were no longer confined to the poor, the marginalized, or the socially suspect. Prominent citizens, wealthy landowners, and even respected church members were now being named. The afflicted girls, once seen as instruments of God exposing hidden evil, seemed to be casting their net wider with reckless abandon. Families who had once applauded the purging of witches now feared for their own safety. The narrative of the devil's conspiracy, once compelling, began to show cracks. Salem was living in a paradox. The more people accused, the less credible the trials seemed, yet the machinery of fear ground on relentlessly. The seeds of doubt had been sown, but they struggled to grow in soil still watered with blood. One of the most dramatic events of the Salem Witch Trials occurred in September with the ordeal of Giles Corey, an elderly farmer known for his stubbornness and blunt character. Corey's wife, Martha, had already been accused and imprisoned, partly because she had openly criticized the trials. When suspicion turned against Giles himself, he refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. According to English law, without a plea, a trial could not proceed. The court, determined to break his resistance, resorted to the brutal practice of peine forte et dure, pressing a prisoner with heavy stones until he either entered a plea or died. Corey was stripped, laid on the ground, and as boards and stones were piled upon his chest, he refused to yield. Witnesses recalled that his last words were not of confession or despair, but defiance. More weight. After 2 days of agony, he was crushed to death. His refusal to enter a plea meant that his property could not be confiscated, thereby ensuring that his heirs would inherit his land. In his final act, Corey denied the court the power to destroy his family's future. His death sent shockwaves through Salem. While some viewed it as proof of stubborn guilt, others saw in his resistance a profound condemnation of the trials themselves. Here was a man so convinced of the court's injustice that he chose a horrific death rather than lend legitimacy to the proceedings. Giles Corey's fate became a turning point, a moment when the cruelty of the trials stood revealed in stark relief. His courage carved a crack in the wall of fear, and through that crack, the first rays of reason began to shine. Even as executions continued, the tide of public opinion began to shift. Prominent voices within the colony started to question the use of spectral evidence, which allowed dreams and visions to be treated as proof of guilt. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers of Massachusetts, warned that it was better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. His words, though carefully measured, carried weight. At the same time, ordinary citizens grew weary of the relentless accusations. Families who had once believed the afflicted girls now whispered that their performances seemed exaggerated, even theatrical. Some of the accused, under questioning, confessed and named dozens of supposed accomplices, but their wild claims stretched credibility. Could so many people truly be servants of Satan? The sheer scale of the accusations made the narrative less believable. Doubt spread quietly through taverns, marketplaces, and church pews. Yet, the fear of being accused still silenced open opposition. Resistance took the form of hesitation, of subtle gestures, of unease in the face of yet another condemnation. The colony was at a crossroads. The trials had not yet ended, and executions would continue, but the foundation of Hysteria had begun to crack. The deaths of respected figures, the brutality inflicted on Giles Corey, and the questioning of spectral evidence all signaled that Salem's nightmare was nearing its breaking point. Fear still ruled the day, but its reign was no longer absolute. For the first time, hope flickered that reason might return and that the madness could be stopped. By October 1692, the Salem Witch Trials had reached a breaking point. Nearly 24 people had been executed, and more than 100 others were still imprisoned, awaiting trial. The weight of the hysteria had begun to press heavily on the leaders of Massachusetts. Prominent ministers, magistrates, and even members of the governor's council were beginning to see the chaos not as a triumph of godly justice, but as a dangerous failure. At the center of the unease was the reliance on spectral evidence, the visions, dreams, and invisible torments described by the afflicted girls. For months, the court had accepted this testimony as decisive proof of guilt. But by autumn, cracks appeared in this reasoning. If Satan could assume the shape of innocent people, then how could anyone be certain that the spectral visions were genuine? Could the devil not deceive the eyes of the afflicted, making them see guilt where none existed? These theological questions, once ignored, now became impossible to dismiss. Reverend Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather, though initially supportive of the trials, began to express caution. Their sermons urged restraint, warning that condemning innocence was a far greater sin than letting guilty witches escape. Even Governor William Phipps, who had authorized the special court of Oyer and Terminer, grew alarmed when the accusations extended to members of his own household and close allies. The machinery of paranoia was devouring not only the weak, but also the powerful. As the circle of suspicion widened, Salem's leaders realized that the credibility of their entire legal system, and perhaps the survival of the colony's fragile government, was at stake. The moment that truly threatened the authority of the court came when accusations reached the highest levels of society. The afflicted girls, emboldened by months of power, began naming individuals who could not easily be dismissed as marginal figures. Among those accused was Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor himself. Although the charge against her was quickly suppressed, it revealed the dangerous trajectory of the trials. If the devil's conspiracy truly extended into the governor's household, then no one in Massachusetts was safe. Other accusations struck at the colony's elite as well. Prominent merchants, respected ministers, and wealthy landowners found themselves under suspicion. This development shook the foundations of the court's authority. It was one thing to condemn beggars, widows, and unpopular villagers. It was another to risk the collapse of social order by accusing the colony's leaders. Whispers began to spread that the trials were spiraling out of control, manipulated by personal grudges and opportunism rather than divine justice. Families who had once cheered the executions now hesitated, worried that their own names might be next. In the council chambers of Boston, political leaders debated whether the hysteria had become a greater threat than the witches themselves. The credibility of the court of Oyer and Terminer was crumbling under the weight of its own excesses. Every new accusation against the elite exposed the trials not as a godly purge, but as a reckless crusade that threatened to destroy the colony from within. The decisive blow came in late October, when Governor William Phipps officially intervened. Confronted with growing public dissent, pressure from respected ministers, and the danger of political collapse, Phipps ordered the dissolution of the court of Oyer and Terminer. In its place, he established a new superior court of judicature, which specifically rejected spectral evidence as admissible proof. This change marked a dramatic shift in the legal handling of witchcraft cases. Without the visions and torments of the afflicted girls to rely upon, prosecutors found it far more difficult to secure convictions. Many of the imprisoned were gradually released, and though some trials continued into 1693, the momentum of hysteria was broken. For those who had already died on the gallows, justice came too late. But for the community, the dissolution of the court represented the beginning of the end of the nightmare. The authority that had driven the witch hunts had collapsed under its own contradictions. Salem, once consumed by fear, now faced a painful reckoning. How could they explain the deaths of innocent people? How could they reconcile their faith with the cruelty they had inflicted. The official end of the court did not erase the trauma, but it signaled a turning tide. What had begun as a crusade against Satan had ended in the recognition that the true danger lay not in witches, but in the destructive power of fear and hysteria. Salem's leaders had finally acted, but the damage was already carved into the colony's history forever. When Governor William Phips dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer in late October 1692, the executions finally stopped. Yet, for many men and women, the nightmare was not over. More than 100 people still languished in cold, overcrowded prisons, accused but not yet tried. Some had been locked away for months, chained in darkness, their families forced to pay for their food and lodging while they awaited uncertain fates. The shift to a new superior court of judicature in early 1693 offered a sliver of hope, for this new tribunal rejected spectral evidence, the very foundation upon which most convictions have been secured. Without the girl's visions and accusations of spectral torment, many cases collapsed. Gradually, prisoners were acquitted or released, though often only after paying heavy fees to cover court costs and jail expenses. Freedom came at a price, and for many, the financial burden was devastating. Some who had confessed to witchcraft, hoping to save their lives, now faced the shame of living with a false stain on their names. Families reunited, but scars remained, property lost, reputations destroyed, and loved ones buried in shallow graves near Gallows Hill. The prisons slowly emptied, yet for those who had survived the ordeal, the trauma lingered. They returned to homes where neighbors still whispered, to communities fractured by suspicion, and to a world that seemed forever changed. The physical chains had been broken, but the invisible chains of memory and fear endured, binding Salem in silence long after the last trial had ended. In the immediate aftermath of the trials, Salem was a community paralyzed by guilt and shame. The executions had claimed not just the poor and the powerless, but also respected church members, elderly grandparents, and even a minister. The fact that so many innocent lives had been destroyed could not easily be explained away. Yet open discussion of the trials was rare in the months that followed. To admit error was to confront unbearable truths, that fear had triumphed over reason, that justice had been corrupted by paranoia, that neighbors had betrayed neighbors. Families who had lost loved ones remained silent, too fearful or too broken to demand justice. Others who had benefited from the confiscation of property or the silencing of rivals preferred to bury the memory of their complicity. Ministers tried to frame the trials as a tragic misunderstanding rather than an indictment of the colony's faith and governance. In sermons, they urged repentance for the sins that had allowed Satan to deceive them, but they stopped short of directly condemning the court or its decisions. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Salem lived with the weight of unspoken grief and unresolved anger. The very soil seemed haunted by the memory of those who had been hanged. Children grew up with the knowledge that their parents had been branded as witches. The community's refusal to openly confront the injustice deepened the wounds, leaving them festering beneath the surface. Salem had escaped the gallows, but it had not yet escaped the shadow of its own conscience. Although the trials formally ended in 1693, their legacy endured for decades. The economic damage was severe. Families of the executed were left destitute, their property seized or debts unpaid. Wives became widows, children became orphans, and entire households collapsed into poverty. The social fabric of Salem Village and the surrounding towns was shredded by mistrust. Neighbors who had once prayed together now crossed the street to avoid each other, haunted by memories of accusations flung in anger or fear. The afflicted girls, once treated as prophets, faded into obscurity, their authority destroyed by the discrediting of spectral evidence. Some married and moved away, but the memory of their role in the hysteria followed them. For the ministers and magistrates who had presided over the trials, the aftermath brought unease. While some attempted to defend their actions as necessary in a time of crisis, others quietly admitted their mistakes. Yet no apology could undo the damage. The trauma of Salem left deep psychological scars, not only on the families directly affected, but on the colony as a whole. Massachusetts had witnessed how fear could warp justice, how religious fervor could descend into cruelty, and how fragile the line was between order and chaos. The scars of the trials did not heal quickly. They shaped the identity of the community for generations, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked hysteria. Salem was left to live with its ghosts, not only the spirits of those who had died, but the haunting awareness of what fear had driven its people to do. In the wake of the Salem Witch Trials, ministers across Massachusetts were forced to reckon with their role in the tragedy. At the height of the hysteria, many had supported the court, preaching fiery sermons about the devil's presence in New England and encouraging the purging of witches as an act of divine duty. Now, with the trials discredited and the executions widely recognized as wrongful, these same ministers struggled with guilt and the erosion of their moral authority. Reverend Increase Mather, who had once endorsed the careful use of spectral evidence, became one of the first to openly question the wisdom of the court. His statement that it is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned was a direct rebuke to the logic that had fueled the executions. His son, Cotton Mather, whose writings and sermons had helped justify the trials, tried to defend his actions by claiming he had urged caution, but his reputation never fully recovered. Other ministers delivered sermons of repentance, urging their congregations to seek forgiveness for the sins that had allowed fear to triumph over faith. Yet the sincerity of these gestures was often questioned. For the families of the executed, no sermon could bring back their loved ones or erase the stain of false accusations. The clergy's role in fanning the flames of hysteria left a permanent scar on their authority, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth that their faith, meant to guide and protect, had been used as a weapon of destruction. The struggle for justice had to begin with an honest reckoning, and for many ministers, that reckoning was painful and incomplete. Just as the ministers faced their guilt, so too did the accusers, the afflicted girls whose testimonies had sent so many to the gallows. In the years after the trials, their lives followed different paths. Some faded into obscurity, their names remembered only in infamy. Others married, raised families, and tried to live quietly, though whispers of their role in the hysteria followed them wherever they went. One of the most notable was in Putnam Jr., who had been among the most active of the accusers. In 1706, more than a decade after the trials, and stood before her church congregation in Salem Village and publicly confessed to her role. With tears, she admitted that her accusations had been driven by deception and delusion, and she begged forgiveness for the innocent lives lost because of her words. Her confession, though deeply moving, could not undo the suffering she had helped cause. For many, it symbolized the tension between human weakness and the destructive force of collective fear. Other accusers never made such public statements, whether out of shame, denial, or fear of retribution. They remained silent. The community, too, hesitated to press the issue, preferring to bury the memory rather than reopen old wounds. Yet the silence was telling. Salem knew that its children had been instruments of injustice, and the weight of that truth hung heavy over the generations that followed. The voices that had once held the power of life and death were now reduced to whispers of regret and the uneasy quiet of unfinished atonement. For the families of those executed, the years following the trials were marked by both grief and determination. Many sought to clear the names of their loved ones, petitioning the government for legal redress. The process was slow and fraught with resistance. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching to atone for the tragedy of Salem. Ministers preached sermons of repentance, and Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the leading figures of the trials, publicly confessed his guilt and begged for God's forgiveness. This act was extraordinary, a judge admitting fault in a public forum, but it was only the beginning. Families continued to demand that official records be corrected, that property be restored, and that the stigma of witchcraft be lifted from the names of the innocent. In 1711, the colony passed a law restoring the legal rights and good names of many of the accused and providing financial compensation to their heirs. Yet even this restitution was incomplete. Not all families received recognition, and the pain of loss could not be measured in money or legal documents. The struggle for justice reflected the deep wounds Salem carried, a recognition that the law, meant to protect, had been twisted into a tool of terror. The legacy of these efforts was a slow, halting attempt at reconciliation, a community groping toward healing while never fully escaping the shadows of its own past. Salem's fight for justice did not end in 1692. It continued for decades, carried by the voices of the bereaved who refused to let history forget. The Salem Witch Trials left Massachusetts deeply shaken, but their impact extended beyond one village or colony. In the immediate years that followed, colonial leaders recognized that the events of 1692 had exposed the dangerous weaknesses in their system of justice. For the Puritans, who had built their society on strict adherence to religious law, the trials were a humiliating lesson in how fear and faith could be twisted into instruments of injustice. The collapse of the court of Oyer and Terminer and the discrediting of spectral evidence forced the colonies to adopt stricter standards of proof in legal proceedings. Judges grew wary of accepting uncorroborated testimony, and ministers became more cautious in claiming divine authority for political or legal actions. The trials served as a warning that unchecked belief in invisible forces could corrode the very foundations of justice. Colonial leaders began to insist that witchcraft accusations must be supported by tangible evidence, not merely by visions or dreams. This shift did not eliminate fear of the supernatural, which remained strong well into the 18th century, but it did temper the willingness of courts to pursue such cases with deadly fervor. Salem had become a cautionary tale, whispered not only in Massachusetts, but across the English colonies in North America. It revealed how fragile the boundary was between order and chaos, how quickly neighbor could turn against neighbor, and how devastating the consequences could be when law surrendered to hysteria. The lesson was bitter, but it planted the seeds of a more cautious, evidence-based approach to justice in the colonies. The trials also forced a profound reevaluation of religious authority in colonial New England. The Puritans had believed themselves to be a chosen people, tasked with building a godly society in the wilderness. Salem shattered that self-image. If God's people could be so deceived, so consumed by fear that they killed innocents in his name, what did that say about the purity of their mission? Ministers who had once thundered about the devil's presence now found themselves preaching about humility, repentance, and the dangers of pride. The events of 1692 revealed that even the most devout could fall victim to error. This realization slowly loosened the grip of strict Puritan orthodoxy on the colonies. Younger generations, already restless under the rigid rules of their parents, pointed to Salem as evidence of the dangers of excessive zeal. Over time, religious tolerance began to grow, though slowly and unevenly. The trials became part of a broader colonial debate about the relationship between church and state, about whether spiritual beliefs should dictate legal outcomes. While Puritan ministers remained influential, their authority was no longer unquestioned. The shadow of Salem lingered over every sermon, a reminder that religious fervor without restraint could destroy rather than protect. The trials had not only claimed lives, they had undermined the moral certainty of an entire society. Out of that uncertainty, new ideas about liberty, conscience, and the limits of authority began to take root. Ideas that would eventually shape the political culture of colonial America. In a paradoxical way, the Salem Witch Trials contributed to the development of an American identity. The tragedy highlighted the dangers of blind obedience to authority and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked mass hysteria. These lessons would resonate in the coming decades as colonists faced other crises of governance and conscience. The insistence on stricter legal standards, the growing skepticism toward religious dominance, and a recognition of individual rights all drew strength from the memory of Salem. In taverns and town meetings, colonists recalled the trials as an example of what could happen when power went unchallenged. The idea that justice must be based on evidence, not fear, slowly became part of the legal fabric of the colonies. Moreover, Salem's story echoed in the broader narrative of liberty that was beginning to stir in the 18th century. When colonists later resisted British authority, they drew on a tradition of questioning power that had been reinforced by the bitter memory of the witch trials. Salem became, in its own tragic way, part of the foundation of American democracy, a warning that liberty required vigilance, that justice demanded courage, and that freedom could be lost when fear triumphed over reason. Though the trials were a stain on Massachusetts' history, they were also a lesson that endured far beyond the boundaries of one village. Salem's legacy was not only about witchcraft, it was about the struggle to define justice, freedom, and identity in a new world. In the immediate decades following 1692, Salem's tragedy was not often spoken of publicly. The community, scarred by shame and haunted by guilt, preferred silence to open discussion. Families who had lost loved ones carried the burden of grief privately, while those who had participated in the accusations or trials lived under the shadow of complicity. Ministers occasionally preached sermons of repentance, and official proclamations of fasting were issued to acknowledge the colony's sins, but the events were rarely recounted in detail. For many, the memories were too raw, the wounds too deep. Yet silence did not mean forgetfulness. Within households, stories were whispered from parents to children, warnings of what fear and suspicion could do. The names of Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, and George Burroughs lingered as reminders of courage in the face of injustice. The afflicted girls who had once commanded power grew into adulthood, their reputations tarnished by their role in the hysteria. Neighbors remembered, and memories carried into the next generation. This uneasy silence became part of the cultural memory of New England. Salem was never forgotten, but was not yet mythologized. The weight of the trials hung like a shadow over the region, a cautionary tale whispered rather than proclaimed. The silence itself was part of the legacy, a collective unwillingness to confront the darkest chapter of Puritan history directly, leaving it to fester beneath the surface until writers and historians would one day bring it into the light. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Salem began to re-emerge in written history. Early chroniclers, often ministers or political figures, sought to interpret the events of 1692 in ways that justified their own roles or reflected the religious struggles of the time. Cotton Mather, one of the central figures of the trials, published accounts that attempted to explain the hysteria as part of a cosmic battle between God and Satan. His writings emphasized the danger of witchcraft while downplaying the injustices of the court. Other authors, however, began to take a more critical stance. Historians like Thomas Hutchinson, the colonial governor and author of the History of Massachusetts Bay, portrayed the trials as a cautionary episode of fanaticism and judicial error. As time passed and Puritan dominance waned, writers found in Salem a symbol of the dangers of combining unchecked religious zeal with political authority. By the 19th century, the Salem Witch Trials were no longer simply a shameful local memory, but a subject of national reflection. Writers recognized the trials as a distinctly American tragedy, one that revealed both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of the colonial experiment. In early historical accounts, Salem became a mirror in which Americans could examine the consequences of fear and the fragility of justice. The trials were not just about witchcraft. They were about the misuse of power and the ease with which human beings could destroy one another in the name of righteousness. These accounts began to shape the cultural narrative of Salem, moving it from silence into the realm of historical lesson. The most enduring legacy of the Salem Witch Trials emerged not only in history, but in literature. Writers and dramatists found in Salem a powerful symbol of paranoia, injustice, and the clash between individual conscience and collective fear. In the 19th century, American authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne, himself a descendant of one of the Salem judges, wrestled with the moral weight of the trials. Hawthorne's works, such as The Scarlet Letter and Young Goodman Brown, while not direct retellings, were deeply influenced by the Puritan past and its legacy of guilt and sin. Salem became a backdrop for exploring themes of hypocrisy, repression, and the destructive power of judgment. In the 20th century, Arthur Miller's play The Crucible immortalized the trials for modern audiences. Written during the era of McCarthyism in the 1950s, Miller used Salem as an allegory for the Red Scare, when Americans were accused of communist sympathies with little evidence. The play highlighted the timeless nature of mass hysteria and the dangers of sacrificing truth for conformity. Through The Crucible, Salem's story became not only an American tragedy, but a universal warning. Today, the Salem Witch Trials live on in countless books, plays, films, and cultural references. They symbolize both the darkness of human fear and the resilience of memory. Literature transformed Salem from a local disaster into a global metaphor for the consequences of paranoia and the necessity of protecting justice. Through the written word, the voices silenced in 1692 found a kind of immortality, reminding each generation of the dangers of repeating the past. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 did not fade quickly from the consciousness of colonial America. For political leaders, magistrates, and ordinary citizens alike, Salem became a dark reference point in debates about governance and justice. In the decades that followed, the trials were cited as an example of how unchecked authority could destroy the very people it was meant to protect. Colonial governments across New England recognized that the failure in Salem was not merely religious but political. A court, established by the state, had sanctioned executions based on the flimsiest of evidence, encouraged by ministers and legitimized by governors. This recognition forced a reevaluation of the relationship between law, evidence, and power. The colony's eventual decision to disallow spectral evidence was one of the earliest examples of legal reform prompted by public outrage. The trials taught leaders that justice must be grounded in tangible, verifiable facts rather than spiritual claims. This insistence on stronger evidentiary standards would slowly seep into colonial jurisprudence, influencing how future courts handled accusations not only of witchcraft but of other crimes. The broader lesson was clear. When fear dictated law, liberty was endangered. Salem became a warning sign against the abuse of state power. The trials revealed that governments could easily become instruments of persecution if not checked by reason, fairness, and accountability. These lessons would echo through the 18th century, shaping debates about governance that eventually culminated in the American Revolution. Salem's tragedy thus became part of the foundation upon which a new political identity was built, one that valued caution in law and vigilance against tyranny. In the colonies, where tensions between individual rights and communal authority were constantly negotiated, the memory of Salem served as a powerful reminder of what could happen when liberty was sacrificed to fear. The Puritan ideal of a tightly knit, godly community had collapsed into suspicion and violence, proving that unity imposed by terror was fragile and destructive. As Enlightenment ideas spread through the colonies, intellectuals pointed to Salem as a cautionary tale. The trials were invoked in discussions about freedom of conscience, the need for limits on government power, and the dangers of mass hysteria. Writers and thinkers argued that individual rights must be protected, even in times of crisis, because the alternative was persecution. Salem was not yet framed in the language of civil liberties as we understand it today, but the seeds of that concept were planted in the recognition that justice had been corrupted by fear. When colonial leaders later resisted British authority, they did so with a heightened awareness of how unchecked power could spiral into oppression. Salem was remembered as an example of tyranny not from a distant monarch, but from within their own society. It taught them that vigilance was needed not only against outside rulers, but against the dangerous impulses of their own communities. In this sense, Salem helped nurture an American suspicion of concentrated power, a suspicion that became a cornerstone of the Revolution and the founding of the United States. The lessons of 1692 would resonate as colonists demanded not only freedom from Britain, but safeguards against the repetition of Salem's tragedy at home. By the mid-18th century, as the colonies edged closer to rebellion against Britain, the Salem Witch Trials were increasingly viewed as a symbol of the dangers of unrestrained authority. Revolutionary pamphleteers and preachers occasionally invoked Salem when warning against the tyranny of Parliament and the Crown. Just as the courts of 1692 had silenced dissent and condemned innocence, so too, they argued, did Britain threaten to impose unjust laws on the colonies without fair representation. The memory of Salem merged with the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, evidence, and individual rights. Where Puritans had once justified executions with appeals to divine will, revolutionary thinkers insisted that law must serve the people and be accountable to truth rather than superstition. In this way, Salem contributed, however indirectly, to the shaping of American political identity. It reminded colonists of their vulnerability to hysteria and their need for institutions grounded in fairness. Salem's failure was often contrasted with the ideals the Revolution sought to achieve: a government where power was limited, justice was impartial, and liberty was safeguarded. Though it remained a tragedy rooted in fear, Salem became part of a larger narrative of American growth, proof that the colonies could learn from their darkest mistakes. By the time the Revolution erupted in 1775, Salem's ghost had become woven into the political imagination of America, warning future generations that freedom could only survive if protected by reason, justice, and courage. The lessons of 1692 had traveled far beyond a small New England village, shaping the very ideas on which a nation was born. By the early 18th century, the intellectual climate of the Atlantic world was shifting. The Enlightenment, a movement emphasizing reason, science, and rational inquiry, began to take root in the American colonies. Salem's tragic witch trials, still fresh in memory, became a stark example of the dangers of superstition and blind belief. Colonial thinkers, influenced by European philosophers such as John Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, contrasted the irrational hysteria of 1692 with the promise of reason and empirical evidence. In taverns, lecture halls, and churches, Salem was cited as proof that communities must guard against the tyranny of ignorance. The trials demonstrated how easily fear could override logic, and how quickly authority could be corrupted when evidence was abandoned in favor of visions and rumors. Enlightenment advocates in New England argued that knowledge, tested, verified, and shared, was the only safeguard against repeating such disasters. Natural philosophy, the early form of science, began to grow in popularity. Colonists studied astronomy, medicine, and experimental sciences, eager to ground their understanding of the world in observable reality rather than superstition. This shift did not mean that belief in the supernatural vanished overnight, but Salem had taught many that unchecked reliance on the unseen could destroy entire communities. In this way, the trials indirectly fueled a growing skepticism that aligned perfectly with Enlightenment ideals. The memory of Salem's errors helped prepare the colonies for a broader intellectual awakening, one that valued evidence over accusation and reason over hysteria. One of the most significant outcomes of the post-Salem era was the rise of medical and scientific explanations for phenomena once attributed to witchcraft. During the trials, the afflicted girls' fits, convulsions, and hallucinations have been interpreted as the direct work of Satan. By the 18th century, however, physicians and intellectuals began to suggest alternative explanations. Some theorized that illnesses such as epilepsy, psychological trauma, or even ergot poisoning from contaminated rye could have been responsible for the girl's strange behavior. While these ideas were not widely accepted at first, they reflected a profound change in thinking, that natural causes could explain what had once been seen as supernatural. Universities like Harvard encouraged the study of natural philosophy, and colonial physicians increasingly sought to diagnose illnesses with reference to bodily processes rather than demonic forces. The Salem experience lingered as a cautionary tale, pushing scholars to question whether invisible spirits or observable science should guide their understanding of the world. Gradually, the authority of science began to rival that of theology in matters of daily life. Though religion remained central to colonial identity, the trials had shown that blind reliance on spiritual explanations could have catastrophic consequences. As scientific inquiry grew stronger, skepticism toward witchcraft grew as well. By the mid-18th century, very few in New England still believed that witches were real threats. Instead, Salem became a symbol of outdated superstition, a reminder of how ignorance had once cost innocent lives. Science had begun to replace fear, and Salem's tragedy had played a part in that transformation. The growing skepticism after Salem did not only influence science and medicine, it also reshaped the intellectual and religious life of the colonies. Younger generations, disillusioned with the rigidity of Puritan orthodoxy, began to seek more tolerant and rational approaches to faith. The memory of 1692 lingered as evidence that religious zeal, left unchecked, could lead to cruelty and injustice. This awareness encouraged dissenting voices who called for moderation and freedom of conscience. Some ministers embraced Enlightenment ideas, blending faith with reason and urging their congregations to see God's truth revealed not only in Scripture, but in the natural world. Others resisted, clinging to the belief that the devil remained an active threat. The tension between faith and reason defined much of the 18th century colonial experience, but Salem had tipped the balance towards skepticism. Communities increasingly viewed witchcraft accusations as relics of a darker past, unworthy of a people striving toward progress. The trials became a powerful argument for those who advocated separation between church and state, for if the law had not been entangled with spiritual fears, perhaps so many lives would not have been lost. Rational dissent took many forms: calls for scientific inquiry, demands for legal reform, pleas for religious tolerance. But beneath them all lay the memory of Salem. The hysteria of 1692 had revealed the fragility of human judgment and the dangers of allowing fear to dictate truth. Out of that revelation grew a culture more cautious, more skeptical, and more determined to ground justice and governance in reason rather than passion. Salem's darkness had inadvertently lit the path toward enlightenment in America. The most immediate and enduring legal consequence of the Salem Witch Trials was the rejection of spectral evidence. In 1692, the testimony of the afflicted girls, claims of being pinched, choked, or tormented by invisible specters, have been considered sufficient proof to condemn people to death. The reliance on such intangible evidence was one of the key forces that allowed the hysteria to spiral out of control. After the collapse of the trials, colonial leaders realized the danger of permitting visions and dreams to dictate life or death decisions. By the early 1700s, Massachusetts courts explicitly ruled out spectral evidence, demanding physical, verifiable proof in criminal cases. This marked a turning point in colonial jurisprudence. For the first time, the law in New England acknowledged that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. The rejection of spectral evidence did not immediately create a perfect legal system, but it set a precedent. Courts must rely on rational, observable facts rather than unprovable spiritual experiences. This shift helped lay the groundwork for evidentiary standards that would later define the American legal tradition. Salem had shown, in the most brutal way possible, what could happen when courts allowed imagination to replace reason. The deaths of 19 innocent people became the cautionary example that spurred reform. In a sense, those who perished in 1692 helped shape the principle that justice must be rooted in evidence, not fear, a principle that would become central to the American legal system in the centuries to come. Another profound lesson drawn from the Salem Witch Trials was the importance of due process. In 1692, the accused had little chance to defend themselves. Lawyers were rarely provided, cross-examination was limited, and confessions were often extracted under extreme pressure or in exchange for promises of leniency. The rules of justice had been bent to serve the hysteria rather than the truth. In the years that followed, colonial lawmakers sought to strengthen protections for the accused. Gradually, the right to legal counsel, the ability to confront accusers, and the presumption of innocence gained firmer ground in Massachusetts courts. The trauma of Salem had shown that without safeguards, the judicial process could easily become a weapon of persecution. The memory of neighbors testifying against one another, of children's words outweighing reason, and of confessions forced through fear lingered as warnings. Legal reforms in the colonies increasingly emphasized procedure. Trials must follow established rules, and judges must remain impartial. While these principles were not always perfectly applied, the push for stronger due process was a direct response to the failures of Salem. By the time of the American Revolution, the insistence that individuals had a right to fair trial and protection from arbitrary power was deeply ingrained in colonial political thought. The miscarriages of justice in 1692 had taught Americans that freedom and justice were inseparable. To protect liberty, courts had to ensure fairness for even the most despised or feared individuals. In this way, Salem's dark past contributed to the birth of American constitutional values. The legacy of Salem's legal failures did not end in colonial Massachusetts. When the United States was founded more than 80 years later, the lessons of Salem found echoes in the nation's legal framework. The Bill of Rights, adopted in 1791, enshrined protections designed to prevent the abuses that had defined 1692. The rights to a speedy and public trial, to confront witnesses, to have legal counsel, and to avoid cruel and unusual punishment all reflected an awareness of how fragile justice could be in the absence of safeguards. Salem served as a reminder that hysteria and prejudice could overwhelm reason, and that institutions must be built to resist such pressures. American jurists in the 18th and 19th centuries occasionally reference Salem as a warning of what happens when courts fail in their duty to uphold fairness. Even in modern times, Salem is invoked in legal discourse as an example of witch hunts, cases where public opinion, prejudice, or political agendas threaten to override evidence and due process. The trials stand as a foundational lesson in American law, that justice cannot rest on fear, that rights must be protected even for the unpopular, and that courts must be bulwarks against, not instruments of, mass hysteria. Salem's tragedy thus transcended its own era. The voices silenced on Gallows Hill helped ensure that future generations would enshrine protections for the accused, building a legal system that strove, however imperfectly, to avoid repeating the mistakes of 1692. From colonial courts to the U.S. Constitution, Salem's lessons endured as warnings carved into the bedrock of American law. In the immediate decades after the Salem Witch Trials, the event was remembered with discomfort, shame, and a strong desire to move on. The 18th century was an era when New England sought to define itself not by superstition, but by order, commerce, and the emerging ideals of the Enlightenment. Salem's tragic year of 1692 was not erased, but it was rarely spoken of openly. Ministers occasionally mentioned it in sermons as a warning against the devil's deception or human weakness, but the details were softened, the names obscured. Many families preferred silence, as to speak of the trials meant to reopen wounds and confront memories of betrayal. For the children and grandchildren of the accused, the legacy was painful. They inherited both the stigma of being connected to those branded as witches and the bitterness of knowing their kin had died unjustly. Yet in taverns and private gatherings, the story was whispered. Neighbors remembered Rebecca Nurse's quiet dignity, Giles Corey's final defiance, and the afflicted girl's wild performances. These memories passed through oral tradition, simmering beneath the surface of New England culture. Salem became a symbol of something darker than most were ready to admit, a reminder of what communities could do when blinded by fear. The 18th century thus treated Salem with silence more than reflection. Yet silence, as often happens, did not erase memory. It preserved it, waiting for future generations to rediscover, reinterpret, and reshape Salem's story into something larger than a local tragedy. By the 19th century, America was entering a new cultural phase. Romanticism, with its fascination for history, mystery, and moral struggle began to dominate literature and art. In this context, the Salem Witch Trials re-emerged as a subject of intense interest. Writers and historians no longer avoided the story, but embraced it as a symbol of human folly and moral complexity. Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of Salem's most famous literary sons and a descendant of Judge John Hathorne, one of the trial magistrates, grappled with his family's legacy through fiction. In works such as The Scarlet Letter, 1850, and Young Goodman Brown, 1835, Hawthorne explored themes of sin, guilt, repression, and the weight of Puritan history. While not direct retellings of the trials, his works carried their shadow, portraying New England as haunted by its past. Hawthorne's writings transformed Salem from a forgotten village tragedy into a metaphor for the moral struggles of the human soul. Meanwhile, local historians began compiling records, piecing together the events of 1692 in more detail. Their work, though sometimes romanticized, preserved the stories of the accused and the warnings of history. The romantic imagination found in Salem not only a story of superstition, but a parable of justice, conscience, and the dangers of unchecked authority. By the mid-19th century, Salem was no longer just a painful memory. It was becoming part of America's cultural identity, a story retold to reflect the anxieties and moral questions of the age. By the late 19th century, the Salem Witch Trials had moved fully into the realm of national symbolism. No longer confined to local memory, the trials were cited in discussions about justice, democracy, and the dangers of fanaticism. As America wrestled with issues of slavery, civil war, and Reconstruction, writers and politicians sometimes invoked Salem as an allegory. Just as fear and prejudice had driven Salem to hang innocents, so too could national hysteria and hatred destroy the Republic. Salem's trials were increasingly portrayed as an American tragedy, not just a Puritan one. Monuments began to appear, and descendants of the accused worked to restore their ancestors' reputations. The story of Salem became woven into school books and popular histories, teaching children that liberty must be guarded against the poison of mass fear. The growing fascination with the supernatural in 19th century America also gave Salem a strange allure. Ghost stories, seances, and occult interests flourished, and Salem's witchcraft past made it a site of curiosity. Yet beneath the sensationalism lay a deeper lesson. Salem had become shorthand for the dangers of collective paranoia. By the century's end, Salem was not merely a local episode of 1692, but a cautionary tale embedded in the American imagination. It was remembered as both a tragedy of superstition and a symbol of the nation's struggle to balance faith, freedom, and justice. The quiet shame of the 18th century had given way to the cultural spotlight of the 19th. Salem's ghosts were no longer silenced. They had become part of America's story. By the early 20th century, Salem had become more than just a symbol in literature or a cautionary tale passed through generations. It became a subject of serious historical scholarship. Historians and social scientists began to analyze the trials with new tools, seeking explanations beyond the simple narrative of superstition and fear. Scholars looked at the social, political, and economic tensions within Salem Village, arguing that the accusations were fueled not just by belief in witchcraft, but by land disputes, family rivalries, and community fractures. For example, the rivalry between the Putnam and Porter families was examined as a key factor in shaping accusations, with one faction using the hysteria to undermine the other. Economic hardship, frontier wars, and refugee displacement were also studied as contributing pressures that left Salem ripe for paranoia. Some scholars explored the psychological dimensions, suggesting that mass hysteria, repression, and trauma played roles in the afflicted girl's behaviors. Medical theories also gained traction. The idea that ergot poisoning from contaminated rye could have caused hallucinations and convulsions was debated, while others saw the fits as symptoms of epilepsy, post-traumatic stress, or even deliberate deception. These academic inquiries reframed Salem as not merely a story of irrationality, but as a complex event rooted in the social fabric of colonial America. The trials were analyzed in the context of gender as well, with many noting how accusations targeted women who defied expectations of submissiveness, poverty, or piety. By mid-century, Salem was no longer dismissed as a quaint relic of Puritan superstition, but recognized as a profound case study in the dynamics of fear, power, and society. Perhaps the most significant cultural revival of Salem in the 20th century came through the arts, particularly Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible. Written during the height of McCarthyism, when U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy led investigations into alleged communist infiltration of American life, Miller drew a direct parallel between the witch trials and the Red Scare. In both cases, individuals were accused on flimsy or non-existent evidence, pressured to confess, and forced to implicate others to save themselves. Fear of invisible enemies, whether witches in 1692 or communists in 1952, drove communities to sacrifice justice for the illusion of safety. The Crucible became a cultural landmark, reminding audiences that Salem was not just a distant colonial event, but a timeless warning about mass hysteria and political persecution. The play highlighted the courage of those who resisted false accusations, such as John Proctor, and condemned the cowardice of those who allowed fear to dictate justice. Miller's work cemented Salem's place in global consciousness, turning it into a metaphor for any society consumed by paranoia. The popularity of The Crucible ensured that Salem's story would continue to resonate, not only in classrooms, but also in public debates about freedom, truth, and power. During the Cold War, Salem was invoked repeatedly as Americans grappled with the balance between security and liberty. Just as the Puritans had hunted witches, 20th century America hunted communists, and the lesson was clear. Hysteria, whether religious or political, led only to injustice. Beyond scholarship and literature, Salem transformed in the 20th century into a cultural and commercial phenomenon. The city of Salem, Massachusetts, embraced its witch trial legacy, turning sites of tragedy into places of remembrance, tourism, and even spectacle. Museums, reenactments, and guided tours began to flourish, drawing visitors from around the world. The town marketed itself as Witch City, blending somber memorials with kitschy popular culture. Halloween celebrations, witch shops, and occult festivals gave Salem a dual identity, both a place of historical tragedy and a hub of mystical entertainment. This commercialization sparked debate. Was Salem honoring its dead or trivializing their suffering? Some argued that the trial's legacy should be treated with solemnity, while others saw in Salem's transformation a way of keeping the memory alive in modern culture. Popular media also embraced Salem's imagery. Films, television shows, and novels frequently invoked witches and the haunting legacy of 1692. From horror movies to children's cartoons, Salem became shorthand for the supernatural. Yet beneath the entertainment industry's fascination, historians and educators continued to stress the deeper lessons. Salem was not about magic, but about the dangers of fear and injustice. In 1992, on the tricentennial of the trials, Salem erected a memorial to the victims, inscribed with their names and final words. This act symbolized a renewed commitment to remembering Salem not merely as entertainment, but as a solemn lesson. The 20th century thus saw Salem evolve into a multifaceted cultural symbol, at once scholarly case study, political allegory, tourist attraction, and enduring moral warning. In the 21st century, the Salem Witch Trials remain one of the most enduring symbols of American history. Unlike many colonial episodes that have faded into obscurity, Salem has grown in prominence, not diminished. This is because Salem has come to embody universal themes: fear, injustice, paranoia, and the struggle for truth. Modern historians, educators, and cultural commentators treat the trials as a case study in mass hysteria and the dangers of scapegoating. School children across the United States learn about 1692 not simply as an odd tale of superstition, but as a warning about how communities can destroy themselves when fear outweighs reason. Salem is invoked in discussions of civil liberties, political persecution, and the fragile nature of justice. The town of Salem itself has embraced this legacy, creating spaces of remembrance such as the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, where stone benches are inscribed with the names of those who died. These sites serve as places of mourning, reflection, and education. The voices silenced in 1692 are now amplified, their innocence publicly acknowledged. In this way, Salem has transformed from a place of shame into a place of reckoning. The trials are remembered not to perpetuate guilt, but to honor the victims and ensure that the same mistakes are not repeated. Salem's collective memory has become part of America's civic conscience, a reminder that liberty and justice require vigilance and humility in the face of fear. In addition to serving as a historical lesson, Salem continues to be a metaphor for contemporary struggles. The term witch hunt has entered the modern political vocabulary, used by leaders, activists, and commentators to describe situations where individuals or groups are unfairly targeted by suspicion without solid evidence. While the term is often employed loosely or even cynically, its power lies in the enduring resonance of Salem's story. From the Red Scare of the 1950s to post, 9/11 debates over national security, and from the culture wars to political scandals, Salem is cited as a warning against the destructive power of fear-driven persecution. The image of innocent people condemned on the basis of hysteria still resonates in a world where misinformation, conspiracy theories, and panic can spread rapidly through mass media and social networks. Salem, thus, serves as a mirror for each generation, reflecting its anxieties back at itself. The afflicted girls of 1692 may be long gone, but their spectral accusations echo in modern contexts where truth is obscured by noise and reason is overwhelmed by passion. The trials remind us that paranoia is not confined to one time or place. It is a recurring human tendency. By studying Salem, modern society confronts its own vulnerabilities. The lesson is stark. Whenever fear overrides evidence, whenever suspicion becomes weaponized, the ghosts of Salem rise again, warning of the consequences of mass paranoia. Today, Salem, Massachusetts, has a dual identity. On one hand, it is a solemn site of memory, with museums, archives, and memorials preserving the stories of those who suffered in 1692. On the other hand, it is a vibrant hub of tourism, particularly during Halloween, when thousands flock to the city for festivals, parades, and celebrations of witchcraft as cultural iconography. This blending of tragedy and entertainment has sparked debate. Some argue that the commercialization of Salem risks trivializing the suffering of innocent victims, reducing their ordeal to a backdrop for costumes and souvenirs. Others see it as a way of keeping the memory alive, ensuring that Salem's history continues to resonate with audiences worldwide. The city has leaned into its branding as Witch City, hosting everything from scholarly conferences to psychic fairs. Scholars, artists, and spiritual practitioners from across the globe visit Salem, turning it into a crossroads of history, culture, and identity. This global interest underscores the universality of Salem's story. Though rooted in one small New England community, the themes of fear, persecution, and resilience resonate across cultures and centuries. In this sense, Salem is no longer merely American history. It is world history. Its legacy belongs to all who struggle with the consequences of fear and the pursuit of justice. The modern Salem is thus a paradox, both a place of mourning and of celebration, of serious reflection and playful imagination. Yet in its contradictions lies its power. Salem has become not just a city, but a symbol, a living reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Although the Salem Witch Trials are among the most famous episodes of witch persecution in history, they were far from unique. For centuries before 1692, Europe had been engulfed in its own witch hunts. From the late 15th century to the mid-17th century, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft across Germany, France, Scotland, Switzerland, and other regions. In Germany alone, some towns lost entire families to the witch craze. Unlike Salem, where executions numbered in the dozens, Europe's trials reached horrific scales, often fueled by inquisitorial courts, political instability, and deeply rooted religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, codified the persecution of witches, describing in lurid detail how they supposedly conspired with the devil, cast spells, and harmed their neighbors. These writings gave legitimacy to hysteria, much as spectral evidence had in Salem. Yet the difference lies in scale and timing. By the late 17th century, European witch trials were already in decline as skepticism and Enlightenment reasoning took hold. Salem, in 1692, was thus an outlier, a tragic echo of Europe's fading witch craze. Still, the similarities were undeniable. Accusations targeted the vulnerable. Confessions were often extracted under pressure, and fear of invisible enemies overwhelmed reason. Salem was part of a larger, global phenomenon of human societies succumbing to paranoia. It showed that even in the New World, with all its promises of freedom and renewal, the old terrors of Europe could take deadly root. Salem also connects to a broader pattern of collective fear and hysteria that has appeared in many societies in different forms throughout history. What unites these episodes is not witchcraft itself, but the dynamics of suspicion, accusation, and the breakdown of rational judgment. In medieval Europe, fear of heresy and demonic possession led to purges and inquisitions. In 20th century America, the Red Scare and McCarthyism mirrored Salem's paranoia almost exactly, with accusations of communism replacing accusations of witchcraft. In more recent times, conspiracy theories, mass panics over disease, or moral crusades against supposed hidden threats often reveal the same mechanisms at work. Fear creates scapegoats, rumor replaces evidence, and communities turn on themselves in the name of protection. Anthropologists have noted that accusations of witchcraft or sorcery exist in many cultures, often as a way of explaining misfortune, illness, or death. Whether in African villages, South American communities, or Asian societies, the idea that unseen malevolent forces cause harm has been a recurring feature of human thought. Salem, therefore, is not only a historical event, but part of a universal human tendency, the urge to assign blame for suffering, especially in times of crisis. What makes Salem stand out is the level of documentation and the fact that it occurred in a society that prided itself on being rational and godly. That paradox, an enlightened colony descending into hysteria, gives Salem its enduring power as a lesson about human vulnerability to fear. It shows us that no society, however advanced, is immune to the forces of paranoia. When we view Salem against the backdrop of European witch trials, global witchcraft beliefs, and other episodes of hysteria, a universal warning emerges. Salem is not merely about Puritans in a New England village. It is about the human condition. Whenever communities face uncertainty, whether from war, disease, or social upheaval, there is a temptation to find simple explanations for complex problems. Scapegoats become convenient targets, and fear can create its own evidence. Salem's victims were hanged not because they were guilty, but because their society needed someone to blame. This pattern has repeated across cultures and centuries. Whether in the persecution of heretics, the burning of supposed witches, or the blacklisting of alleged political traitors. Salem's universality lies in its ability to speak to these patterns, to remind us that hysteria is not a relic of the past, but a danger of the present and the future. The trials warn us that justice, reason, and compassion must always guard against the corrosive power of fear. They show that human beings, when gripped by panic, can destroy their neighbors and justify cruelty in the name of righteousness. But they also remind us of resilience, that societies can learn, reform, and remember. In this way, Salem connects the local with the global, the past with the present, the particular with the universal. It stands as one of history's clearest warnings that hysteria, once unleashed, knows no boundaries of time, place, or culture. The lessons of Salem belong not only to America, but to the entire human family. Modern psychology offers insights into the Salem Witch Trials that were unavailable to the people of 1692. What they interpreted as the devil's work, contemporary scholars often analyze as an outbreak of mass hysteria, also known as collective delusion. This phenomenon occurs when groups of people, often under extreme stress, begin to display similar psychological or physical symptoms without an identifiable medical cause. In Salem, the afflicted girls' fits, screaming, convulsing, claiming invisible torment, were contagious, spreading quickly from one child to another, then to young women across the community. Psychological studies show that such behaviors often arise in tight-knit groups under pressure, where conformity is expected and dissent is dangerous. Salem Village in 1692 was primed for such an outbreak. War on the frontier, economic struggles, religious strictness, and deep social divisions created immense anxiety. The children, especially girls, had little outlet for expression in such a repressive society. Their bodies and voices became instruments through which communal fears were dramatized. Once authority figures validated their claims, doctors declaring witchcraft, ministers warning of Satan, the behaviors were reinforced. The afflicted became both victims and participants in a self-perpetuating cycle of hysteria. Psychology interprets Salem as a classic case of mass hysteria amplified by cultural beliefs in witchcraft. It demonstrates how human minds, under collective stress, can blur the lines between imagination and reality, producing symptoms and accusations that feel utterly real to those involved. Another psychological lens through which Salem is understood is groupthink. The tendency for individuals in a group to conform to a dominant narrative, suppressing doubts in order to maintain unity. In Salem, once the idea of a witch conspiracy took hold, The community's leaders and ordinary members alike reinforced it. To question the trials was to risk becoming a suspect yourself. Fear of isolation and punishment silenced dissent. The magistrates and ministers, acting as authority figures, played a crucial role in shaping this conformity. Modern psychology, particularly studies like Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments and Solomon Asch's conformity tests, reveals how ordinary individuals often comply with authority or group pressure even when it contradicts their own judgment. Salem provides a historical demonstration of this principle. Jurors condemned their neighbors despite personal doubts. Ministers preached about witchcraft even when uneasy, and families turned against one another under the pressure to conform. Once the machinery of accusation began, obedience to authority ensured its continuation. The trials illustrate how collective fear and the desire to belong can override logic and morality. Psychology interprets Salem not as the actions of uniquely cruel individuals, but as a society caught in the grip of powerful group dynamics. This perspective reframes the tragedy. The villagers were not monsters, but human beings vulnerable to the same psychological forces that affect all communities under stress. The lesson is sobering. Salem's hysteria was not an anomaly, but a window into the psychology of fear and obedience. Psychologists also explore the Salem Witch Trials through the lens of trauma and projection. Many of the afflicted girls were children of frontier families, exposed to war, violence, and displacement during King William's War. Refugees carried horrific stories of massacres into Salem Village, and children who had lost parents or homes may have internalized deep psychological wounds. Their strange behaviors can be seen as expressions of trauma in a society that lacked the language to understand it. Projection also played a role. Villagers who felt envy, anger, or resentment could project these emotions onto neighbors by labeling them as witches. In a culture that repressed female expression, especially among young women, accusations became a way of voicing anger or asserting power within rigid boundaries. From a psychoanalytic perspective, the witch trials were a stage on which unconscious fears and desires were enacted under the guise of religion. The afflicted girls' fits, the confessions of accused witches, the sermons of ministers, all can be seen as symbolic expressions of inner conflict, fear of sin, and the desperate need for control in a chaotic world. Modern psychology thus interprets Salem not only as a legal or religious failure, but as a psychological drama, where individuals and groups acted out their anxieties in destructive ways. The trials remind us that the human mind, under strain, is capable of extraordinary distortions of reality. Salem becomes a case study in how trauma, repression, and projection can combine to unleash devastation. The lesson is universal. Without understanding and compassion, fear can twist the psyche into cruelty, and entire societies can be swept away by the storms of the human mind. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 stand as one of the most haunting episodes in early American history. Though only lasting a matter of months, the trials forever changed the way Americans understood justice, religion, and society. Salem was not just an isolated event in a small Puritan village. It was a turning point that exposed the vulnerabilities of human communities when fear overrides reason. 19 people were hanged, one was pressed to death, and more than 100 others endured imprisonment, humiliation, and ruin. Their deaths were not caused by witchcraft, but by hysteria, prejudice, and a collapse of rational judgment. In retrospect, Salem marked the decline of Puritan authority, showing that religious zeal, when fused with political power, could unleash destruction. It also revealed the necessity of stronger legal protections, inspiring reforms that influenced colonial law and later the U.S. Constitution. Salem's tragedy became a catalyst for the rise of skepticism and Enlightenment thinking in America, as colonists sought explanations grounded in science and reason rather than superstition. More than anything, Salem revealed the fragility of justice in the face of fear. It taught that courts, when corrupted by panic, could destroy the innocent and sanctify cruelty. As a historical turning point, Salem was both an ending and a beginning. The end of an era of widespread witchcraft prosecutions in New England, and the beginning of America's long struggle to balance liberty with security, reason with belief, and justice with fear. Beyond its immediate colonial context, Salem speaks to something universal in the human experience. The trials are remembered today not only because of what happened in Massachusetts in 1692, but because they reflect patterns that have appeared across cultures and eras. Salem symbolizes the dangers of scapegoating, the power of mass hysteria, and the ease with which authority can be corrupted by fear. The story resonates with later episodes of persecution. The Inquisition in Europe, the political purges of the 20th century, the Red Scare in America, and countless other witch hunts where individuals were destroyed by suspicion and rumor. Salem's enduring meaning lies in its ability to mirror human weakness. It shows how communities under stress, facing war, disease, or uncertainty, often seek simple answers to complex problems by blaming outsiders, silencing dissent, and demanding conformity. Societies believe they're saving themselves, but in truth they are only hastening their own collapse. Yet Salem also embodies resilience, the eventual rejection of spectral evidence, the apologies of judges and ministers, the petitions of grieving families, all demonstrate the capacity of societies to learn, to repent, and to reform. Salem's universal meaning is twofold. It warns us of what fear can destroy, but it also reminds us of what courage and reflection can rebuild. Its lessons are as urgent in the 21st century as they were 300 years ago. Salem endures not as a relic of the past, but as a living symbol of the human struggle between reason and paranoia, justice and persecution. Today, the Salem Witch Trials are remembered in museums, memorials, books, plays, and classrooms around the world. Salem, Massachusetts, has become both a site of reflection and a global icon, where tourists gather to learn about the victims and where scholars debate the deeper meanings of the tragedy. Yet the true importance of Salem lies not in its commercial popularity, but in its moral lessons. The victims' names, carved into stone at the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, speak across the centuries. Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, George Burroughs, Sarah Good, and many others. Their stories remind us that justice can fail, that truth can be silenced, and that fear can destroy the innocent. The responsibility of remembering Salem is not merely historical, it is ethical. To honor the dead is to remain vigilant against the forces that killed them: hysteria, prejudice, and the misuse of authority. In an age when misinformation spreads rapidly, when communities still fall prey to suspicion, and when fear is often weaponized, Salem's warning is urgent. The trials remind us that freedom and justice are never guaranteed. They must be protected daily by courage, compassion, and reason. Salem's ghosts speak not only of tragedy, but of hope, that by remembering their suffering, we can prevent its repetition. In this way, the story of Salem is unfinished. It continues every time fear rises against reason, every time suspicion overwhelms justice, every time a society faces the temptation of hysteria. The future depends on heeding Salem's lesson, that the price of liberty is vigilance, and the cost of forgetting is tragedy repeated. You've just heard the full story of the Salem Witch Trials. How fear silenced reason, how paranoia turned justice into cruelty, and how an entire community was scarred by its own mistakes. Today, we learned that 19 innocent people were executed, countless others were imprisoned, and all because suspicion was allowed to outweigh truth. Yet we also saw how society slowly confronted its errors, reformed its laws, and began to embrace reason over superstition. The moral of this story is clear. Fear, when unchecked, can destroy communities. But remembrance, reflection, and vigilance can protect liberty and justice. Salem teaches us that the true danger is not witches, but the human capacity to let fear rule over truth. If you found meaning in this journey, I invite you to come back to History Teller YT, where every story reveals not just the past, but the lessons we need for the present and future. Subscribe, stay with us, and join me next time as we uncover more hidden chapters of history. Stories that matter, stories that warn, and stories that inspire.